Hi, it's Luke McBain. Today, a little bit of a different format. I'm going to do a commentary on an existing video on a lecture by Kenneth Stanley with the title, Why Greatness Cannot Be Planned, The Myth of the Objective. Kenneth Stanley also wrote a book on this subject. I can only recommend it. I can also just recommend watching the whole lecture, which he gave, the whole presentation, which he did in 2015 in Washington, on an event which was called Collaboration and the Workplace of the Future. And of course, these are Kenneth Stanley's ideas, not mine. I'm just the person making the connection between what he discovered in his work on artificial intelligence to the subject of leadership. And he himself would put it that in this way, that he has made a stepping stone. I would say I connect what he's working on with what I'm working on, which is leadership as an art form, the art form of meaning creation, and we'll also demonstrate how one ties into the other and why I think his work is really, really interesting. So if you want to see the whole video, I'll link it in the description below. I can just recommend it, also recommend reading his book. And again, take no claim for his discovery. We're just going to watch a little bit his lecture and see to what degree can this be useful for leadership. He makes an interesting claim in the beginning. We'll see that setting objectives can be problematic, and this is in management quite a challenge and also a revolutionary thought, because ever since Peter Drucker's MBO, Management by Objectives, there has not been much new, because management by objectives always outperforms every other form of management. If you yourself are working in a team or a group or a company or institution whatsoever, always ask yourself, what is our objective? What is my objective? If you feel lost, if you feel there's too much chaos, then try setting objectives. I would always recommend that. However, he seems to be onto something which transcends this idea. I would claim what he's describing is actually leadership, and that leadership transcends the setting of objective. My approach, which I'm working on, deals a lot with metaphor, and I claim also that in the future, setting metaphors will actually outperform the setting of objectives. This has several reasons. He goes into it a little bit, that he makes also the point that, of course, objectives limit us from the beginning. So once we set up to achieve something, we can only achieve what is basically in the objective and nothing outside of it and nothing beyond it, which extremely limits our ability to explore and discover the future. And this is highly problematic when you're working in a complex environment, and it is getting more and more complex and chaotic. So objectives will underperform in the future. For example, a different kind of work, as I will propose, management by metaphors, for example, which have a more open system and allow for solutions to emerge in the process itself. But let's have a look here what Kenneth Stanley actually says, how he introduces his work in the beginning.
We were researching artificial intelligence. That's basically what I usually do. But this sentence sounds really strange, but this is true. We ran into a problem with objectives. It's a very general statement. But indeed, we saw a flaw with this very general thing that everybody does, which is setting objectives. And therefore, the consequences of this discovery, which I'm going to show you, they extended way beyond just artificial intelligence to things like creativity, innovation, and collaboration. Let me give you the short summary, but obviously there's a lot of subtleties here. Setting an objective can block its own achievement. But furthermore, it can be an obstacle to creativity and innovation in general, even if you don't have any particular destination in mind. And without and this goes furthermore, it tells us that without protection of individual autonomy, collaboration can become dangerously objective. And I'm going to show you that as well.
So first of all, I apologize that no, Kenneth Stanley is in this small box within a box within a box. Again, you're welcome to watch the whole video in the full-size screen if you wish to do so. So what he actually did, he set up a website called Pick Breeder, and within this website you could choose 2 pictures, and these pictures were rather, they were a random pattern, didn't make much sense, maybe some waves or curves on them, and you could choose a parent or 2 parents and have them breed offspring and so on and so forth, and then you had again 2 parents and you would breed these pictures, right? And what happened was that actually then people who did this discovered real images, which means figures like cars or birds or anything like butterflies or pictures from nature. And this was quite fascinating to see, and that actually people could breed from a rather chaotic, nonsensical environment something which made sense, which had meaning. And as you know, I talk a lot about meaning making and sense making. And you could then, of course, post that picture then online, and others could use that again and start breeding another generation of pictures, and would come up with other pictures based on these existing pictures. And some of them are really quite beautiful. So, and this is what Stanley then calls a stepping stone. So you could use stepping stones and then do further iterations or do more breeding and find other really interesting, beautiful pictures. What is also interesting is that his claim is if you would set yourself first the objective of breeding, for example, this butterfly, and try to get there consciously or on purpose, it's almost impossible to do so. And even trying to program algorithms which do this are not as successful as this process of discovery which humans then had. So apparently when you start breeding these pictures, you seem to be on the trail of something, and then you develop that picture as you go along, and then finally you have that result. And he said you couldn't replicate that if you tried, if you set yourself that objective.
In any complex search space of possibilities, it's always going to be the case that we don't know the intermediate stepping stones that lead to our objective. Because after all, that's almost by definition, because if we did know the stepping stones, then we just go there. So this is the hard problems, the interesting problems are always the ones where we don't know what the stepping stones are. And of course, in a space like this, you can tell just intuitively. I mean, I haven't given you all the under the hood, artificial DNA and stuff like that, because I don't have all the time. But you can tell intuitively that this is a complex search space. It's not simple. So it's not like the things that lead to teapots are all just little mini baby teapots. It's going to be something different. And in that sense, you can't get to these places by trying to get to them. So that's pretty puzzling, because when you look at this, then this really leads to a really deep question, which is then how the heck are people getting to these places? Because they're clearly getting there consistently, but I'm telling you, you can't get there by actually trying. So then what is the key to getting to one of these interesting kinds of discoveries?
So he goes on to explain how that happens. Again, that he has his own hypothesis that certain shapes then remind us of other shapes, and we let ourselves be surprised by this emergent process. However, I would like to point out something else that, as in previous videos, that which I just put out, especially on art and neuroscience, is that as we have seen that the right side of the brain actually sees the environment and the information as a whole, and is able to give us basically a complete picture from which it then sort of like develops metaphors, imageries, other sensations, also bodily sensations, from which we then start selecting and narrowing down that process to arrive at a conclusion or decision. So the rational decision, the result we have at the end. Sometimes we believe it's done through this rational deliberation, but actually what is happening is more like a sculpting process, that we don't know, we look into the future, we don't know exactly what the future means, but we try to make sense of it, and as long as we don't know exactly what it means, we have sort of like this feeling it is like this, which seems to be something which we know, although we don't know quite what it is, and that is metaphorical thinking. So metaphors sort of serve like giving us the landscape, or giving us an intermediate surrounding which we then enter into to explore, to find that which is more definite. In other videos which you can look at, I also looked at how other artists describe the artistic process, especially Tarkovsky and Beuys, and they always talk about the sculpting process. So there seems to be that this sensation of emergence and fluidity, as if you were sculpting away certain other information which you don't find useful, and this is a pre-conscious process until that which seems familiar to you starts to emerge in the consciousness itself and present itself as a solution. And actually, when you look at the video, and if you look at the emergence of these images which are being bred through PicBreeder, even the intermediate pictures don't really make a lot of sense. They don't look like a butterfly or landscape or a teapot at all. He points that out. But there seems to be something in the individual who's doing that, which they have a certain sensation that this is going somewhere. So I'm going to continue along this pathway of weeding out information which I don't find necessary. McGilchrist also points out this process in neuroscience, that actually it is more that the left hemisphere is doing the sculpting process of that information which it does not find useful, so that it comes from the very broad chaotic perspective into something which is more described through senses, through visual imagery, through other senses, through senses which are usually tactile or experienced by the body, and all that is weeded out until the solution becomes apparent. So, and also what's interesting is that some people also, and especially people who are working in leadership and are trying to find solutions, sometimes experience that process as pulling a string towards you. So actually not, as we sometimes have the feeling, moving into the future and creating it, but actually the pulling in a string and the future emerges, which is again the same thing, that you're actually sculpting away information until that arrives in the present time, which you find desirable or the optimal solution. So if you would set yourself objectives right from the beginning, you would have a clear understanding what the future should hold, but it can't then hold necessarily anything else, because you would sort of weed out other information which you don't find desirable, because you the only thing which you have in mind is that particular objective, but you're not able to enter into these emergent processes quite as well.
What would Edison have said? Could you tell me why, or some context?
Purposeful, objective guy. You know, I can see you right now because of him.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. So I think, there are a lot of people who have set out and done something amazing. I mean, Edison's an example, who you may think are counterexamples, or maybe they even somewhat relieve the anxiety I'm giving you, and say, this guy's exaggerating how bad the situation is here, because look at all these achievers. But my interpretation of those things is that what's actually happening is that these visionaries are people who realize that the stepping stones have been laid. It's not that they see several stepping stones into the future like some omnipotent visionary and can see the path. It's that they realize that we're just one stepping stone away because of things that were done by their predecessors. So, things like it took vacuum tubes to build the first computer. But the people who were designing vacuum tubes were not thinking about computers. If you had told those people that they need to work on making a computer, like go back, to the 1800s and say, you're wasting time with vacuum tubes, build a computer, this is a much cooler idea. We would have no vacuum tubes and no computers because they were working on the very stepping stone that we needed. But there was a time where the vacuum tubes were available and the stepping stones had been created. And so that created that possibility, and someone was standing on that stepping stone at that time and realized it's just a little bit of a step from there to computation. And so I think the issue is that somebody like Edison is looking at what has been created in the immediate past and seeing that possibility has been created that's just a stepping stone away that we didn't realize before.
So the question was, how did Edison work? And he gave an answer to that. What I also find very interesting in this idea of stepping stones is, the idea also, how does art function? And the idea sometimes is that, these are very creative people who just work entirely intuitive, they're irrational, crazy, and so creative, and they have these strange thoughts and also. Well, if this was true, basically they wouldn't develop anything, and then you would also not see any progress in art. So that's definitely not the case. And also then this idea of irrationality, Kenneth Stanley also puts a stop to that. He says, and quite rightly so, there are already some stepping stones in place. So we can also observe that of course artists, but anybody else who has these experiences of emergent futures is working off what is actually already known. So people will, and artists also themselves, study for years their craft, or people will go to university and study a certain domain for years, the technicalities, the laws, the principles, the causal effects, and so on and so forth. But to actually to discover something new is a different kind of process, which he then also describes. And it's very similar in management and leadership. Of course, you can study management, strategic management, scenario development, and cash flow planning, and logistics, and I don't know what, and economics, and back and forth. But all these rational explanations of the material world still won't necessarily give you the ability to create an emergent future, which you really need to do in leadership, which is, again, more this artistic process, which in itself is also intertwined with your rational abilities. So he's making a good point there. You're always standing on the shoulders of giants, not just because historically they already have produced certain results, but also within your own intellect. So these stepping stones are basically already within your own mind, within your rational capabilities, and you need them basically to project future possibilities, or to make future possibilities emergent. So this is a false duality to say, well, either you're a rational person or you're a creative person. No, it's the combination of these two elements which really enable you to have an emergent future happening for you, and then lead into that emergent future and communicate that process to others.
A stepping stone is something that can lead somewhere interesting. So it's something that creates potential. And I think that we have become afraid to acknowledge that those with expertise have the ability to identify things that are interesting. The way we think about it is that we need to subject you to some kind of accountability and assessment to make sure that you're not wrong if we go down this path. So we need some kind of objective metric to say, are you moving in the right direction? But the problem is that the stepping stones are the things that we recognize not because they are objectively superior, but because they have some kind of intrinsic potential. And that intrinsic potential is very difficult to formalize, but we see that humans are particularly good at identifying it. So in PickBreeder, the people who are finding the interesting images are playing exactly that game. They see something that they think is interesting, like the egg with the hat, and they publish that because they think it has potential, it's interesting, it's going to lead to other interesting things. We can't exactly say where it's going to lead. And we can see this across, I think, many domains where experts often have these kinds of intuitions. Novelty search, which is this algorithm we created to try to capture this idea, it just says novelty is the proxy. So novelty is like a proxy for interestingness. If you can generate something that's genuinely novel, then that probably will lead to more things that are novel as a stepping stone. But it's not the be-all and end-all of what identifies a good stepping stone. What identifies a good stepping stone is ultimately something subjective, and that's why we have so much discomfort with it, and that's why we tend to align our institutions away from that, because we don't like subjectivity. But we're going to have to accept subjectivity if we're going to embrace this principle, or the objective paradox.
Okay, Eric?
At the end, he makes really an important point, and this is the point about subjectivity. And I also mentioned this in one of my videos, that subjectivity within leadership theory is actually not a problem. It is actually the solution. And yes, this fear of subjectivity is that somehow then things become flavor of the month or pure subjective opinion as opposed to, fact-based, rational reason. However, leadership, just like art, is a different beast. And if you don't ascribe to subjectivity, you will not come to a point where leadership becomes something which you can teach to individuals, similar like art. Tarkovsky himself says subjectivity is not a problem because artists and leaders alike act from their values. So the values is that which guides the subjectivity of the individual. And there's no, in this particular domain, there is no problem with subjectivity, because subjectivity, as Kenneth Stanley also points out, is best suited to deal with chaos and to produce novelty. So this idea also of novelty search, of that, what he calls stepping stones and potential, and again this question of potential and the potential which is then emergent in a future, is really, really interesting, and should be something which is again taught generally in leadership, to say what I'm interested in is to produce that potential within the future, and also then get the talent which is able to do that, because that is for me the stepping stone which I need for my company or my institution. And there's another aspect to this potential, or especially discovering the potential in the future, which is that which I call also entanglement. So that is functions basically in terms of how the human mind starts to entangle with a seemingly chaotic and random future, and starts to make sense of that chaotic environment. And these processes of entanglement of the human mind and the chaotic material world is then what you might call intuition. But if it's only intuition, then you wouldn't be able to train that or to support people who have certain talents in that areas, like artists. And again, I'll use the term by Stanley, which is stepping stones. There are, even within that process of that entanglement of the human mind with the material world, there are some stepping stones in between. There are some criteria, there are some qualifications which can actually be enhanced to train yourself in that process, become more self-confident, and also, especially through self-observation, see how your mind does that, how your mind functions within that process, so that you become more self-confident in producing that future and communicating that to others, to convince them then to follow you or to support you, or to build their own stepping stones, which would be some sort of meta leadership, to be able to give that framework for others to enter into that meaning creation process.
We see this kind of phenomenon in several processes. I mean, PickBreed or novelty search are artificial, but they have no final objective. In other words, in aggregate, the people on PickBreed, they're not searching for some ultimate image. That's why it works. Novelty search isn't searching for some ultimate objective, and that's why it works. Natural evolution There's no uber organism that the whole process was set out to finally discover. It's not us. That's why natural evolution is discovering all this stuff. If we were the objective, we wouldn't be here. Human innovation, which was raised earlier, like science, doesn't have some uber invention that all of us are walking lockstep towards as we converge in. These are the processes that are most prolifically creative that are known to humankind. And we should be modeling our innovative endeavors more closely with the way that they actually work, which is that they are not objectively driven. These are stepping stone collectors, which means that they're not solutions to particular problems. They're accumulators of potential. The more potential they accumulate, the more potential they can accumulate. And it's that divergence that you see intrinsic in that kind of process that makes it so creative.
He makes another very good point at the end, which is divergence of these solutions, and which makes actually the whole system in which they emerge much more viable, resilient, and more interesting. And that also something which we should think of in terms of leadership is that, of course, objectives have this quality of convergence and of hierarchy, and exclude many other viable solutions, which actually make the whole system much more stronger because it is diverse. He also, in the video, gives a warning in terms of this collective objective setting. So in terms, he gives the example of committees which hand out research funds, because within these committees, then a group of people has to agree on a certain item, on a certain objective, and if they can't agree on that, or if they don't see that it cannot be communicated, they have difficulty then in supporting a certain project, which could be promising in delivering future results, but they really have a problem because they're so used of saying, well, what is the objective of what your project is going to achieve? And you can also see that in certain like groupthink settings, where then a group of people comes together and tries to figure out something, and a need to agree on what they are supposed to achieve, and then they very quickly come to this formulation of an objective. So again, the emergence process has a difficult time within a collective setting to really start off, because we're already containing it within this rationalization of objectives. And I also think that's the reason why things like cooperative leadership, distributed leadership, collaborative leadership, all these terms are more or less bound to fail, because again, they build very much on this consensus idea, and there in the consensus process, basically you spiral down to the lowest common denominator in form of an objective, instead of building on diverse solutions and emergent solutions. So yeah, in this form, I thought it was a very interesting lecture. I can just recommend looking at it. It ties in beautifully with what I'm working on in terms of values and art and emergence, and which you can look at these videos and have a look what the interrelationship is between neuroscience, artificial intelligence, and art and leadership, of course, and why individuals actually are still very much needed to create meaning and perspective, and especially diverse perspectives and solutions, which we need in the future, again, to produce other solutions. So I hope you enjoyed this video. For me, it was an entirely new format. I thought it was very interesting. So I hope to see you back at some later date.